Good afternoon and welcome to Hudson Institute. I'm Ken Weinstein, Japan Chair here at Hudson. I am delighted to co-host today's conversation with my colleague, Hudson Senior Fellow Nury Turkel, as we discuss Edward Wong's extraordinary book, At the Edge of Empire, A Family's Reckoning with China. Ed is, of course, the veteran journalist who is now diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times, covering foreign policy from here in Washington. The book, his roots as the son of Chinese immigrants here in Washington, D.C., sets the stage for an absolutely fascinating story. The book is a simply remarkable account of the life of his father, Edward Wong, who was born in Hong Kong, graduated from boarding school in southern China in 1950 before joining the People's Liberation Army in that burst of patriotic fervor that accompanied the 1949 revolution, before his daring escape from China in 1962. And this book is a compelling read. It is a model of both structure and substance, as Ed weaves together his father's story and history, as well as his own accounts of his time in China, a half century or so after his father's time in regions such as Xinjiang and Xi'an. It is a contrast or a comparison of both the Xi and the Mao eras, and it ties together his family's personal story with China's larger transformation, giving us an inside look at the struggles of both individuals and China itself, from the Communist Revolution to Xi's authoritarian rule. Now, we will touch on all of these things, from Ed's family ties, as it were, to the Xinjiang region, what Uyghurs call East Turkestan, to his experiences reporting on human rights abuses against the Uyghurs, and to the broader crackdown under President Xi. But before we get to our discussion, which, as I mentioned, Nury Turkel, who is a Hudson Senior Fellow, was one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world a few years back, and is a noted author himself, we'll have an introduction from Ed, who will show us some slides to put everything in perspective and to make this fascinating story easier for you folks to follow. Let me note that books are available for purchase outside, and they can be purchased electronically, and I would urge everyone to buy a copy of the book. It really is an incredible read and is a terrific way to both learn about Ed's fascinating family story, but more importantly, to see the transformation of China over this extraordinary half century or so. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ed Wong to Hudson Institute.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out on your lunch hour, and thank you to Ken and Nury for helping organize this. We had a great talk earlier this summer when I had a book party in Kalorama, and both of them came there, and it was one of the first launch events for the book, and I appreciate their support and the support that all of you are giving today. So today I wanted to first start off with a slideshow that will give you a sense of one of the main storylines in my book, which is the arc of my father in Mao-era China, how he embraced the revolution at first, worked on the frontiers of China, including East Turkestan, among Uyghurs and Kazakhs, including soldiers that were there, and then eventually becomes disillusioned with the revolution and with Mao's rule and makes his escape to Hong Kong. And the other main storyline in the book, as Ken pointed out, was my own journey through China as a reporter for the New York Times mainly from 2008 up until now, when I'm reporting U.S.-China relations. And during that period, I witnessed a transformation that took place in China, which was, not quite as dramatic as the Mao era, I think, but very dramatic in its own right, and it has a large impact on our world and our lives as Americans, as Xi Jinping moved China in a much more authoritarian direction. And I think many people in Washington are grappling with that today, as well as obviously the residents across China. So we'll start off with the slide. This is My family and I growing up here in Alexandria. I was born in Washington, D.C. I lived for the first year of my life here in Chinatown, and then my parents moved out to Alexandria, where I grew up. And this is us at Mount Vernon. It's a very American photo. And looking at this, you wouldn't be able to tell the sort of dramatic story that that had taken place in my father's background. So can you go to the next slide? This is my father and how I knew him when I was growing up in Alexandria. He went to work at a Chinese restaurant in the area, in Franconia, and this is the uniform that associated with him until much later in my life. He wore this red uniform as an assistant manager at this restaurant, Champagne Cafe in Franconia. And this is the other uniform that I came to know him by in my adult life. In my 20s, I started asking my parents more questions about their background in China. My mother left China, or the People's Republic of China, at a fairly early age after being persecuted by the communists. But my father, at one point, joined the People's Liberation Army, and when I was in my 20s asking him about that, he put this photo in the palm of my hand, and it's one of two existing photos of him in a PLA uniform. Next slide. This is my father at around age 3 or 4. He's the shorter boy. The older one is 4 years his senior, and that's his older brother, Sam, who would take a very different life path than him in early adulthood. Sam would end up coming here to Washington and then working for the U.S. military. So the book is also about these divergent paths that these two brothers took, one to America, the other into the heart of Maoist China, and then eventually how their lives come full circle here in Washington. Next slide. My father, during the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong in 1941, decided with his brother Sam and other family members to go to Guangdong province from Hong Kong. They grew up the children of an herbal medicine dealer, a capitalist family in Hong Kong. Their father sold herbal medicine to other Chinese business people throughout Southeast Asia, as well as in Hong Kong. And when the Japanese occupied Hong Kong, starting immediately after their attack on Pearl Harbor, they made this decision to then go back to their ancestral village in southern China, because the Japanese and the nationalists were still fighting for control of southern China, and no one entity had control of the area, so they felt they might be safer there. My father grew up in Guangzhou, in the capital of Guangdong province, both during the Japanese war, but then also immediately afterwards, when the Japanese surrendered and the Chinese were engaged in the civil war in which the communists, led by Mao, and the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, were fighting for control of China. The main battles took place in northern China. The South was not as afflicted by the violence of the Civil War. But my father did hear much of the ideology that the communists were pushing at the time. There were sympathizers throughout the South. He even thinks one teacher at this prestigious boarding school in Guangzhou that he attended was a communist sympathizer. So he and the other students there heard about the ideals of the revolution, and they also saw around them some of the corruption of the nationalists, including their mismanagement of the economy, the high inflation that afflicted people in Guangzhou. And so this started to turn my father's sympathies more towards the communists. Next slide. He would attend school with his cousins and other close schoolmates who were mostly from that area. Next slide. And this is him in 1950, the spring of 1950, after Mao and the communists have already taken over China. They've proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic, moved the capital to Beijing. And my father, in the spring, decides to apply for university in the north, because what he wants to do is to move closer to where the heart of the revolution is, even as his brother decides to accept a scholarship to come here to study engineering in the US. Next slide. And so many of you are familiar with the topography of China. He takes a train from the South Guangzhou up to Beijing, where he enrolls in Beijing Agricultural University. But on October 1st, 1950, the first anniversary of the founding of the PRC, he marches in Tiananmen Square with other students, soldiers, and factory workers in front of Mao and other senior leaders of the party. And then within weeks of that, he decides to drop out of school and enroll in the military because Mao is exhorting young Chinese men to join the fight against the American forces on the Korean Peninsula. At this time, the Americans and the Chinese and North Koreans are in a pitched campaign for control of the Korean Peninsula. And Mao tells young Chinese that if they don't help defend the motherland, the Americans will march onward to Beijing once they defeat the North Koreans and the Chinese and eventually topple the party. My father still believes in the primacy of the party and decides he has to help defend the motherland. So he gets put into a new arm of the PLA, the Air Force, and he goes north to Manchuria in Harbin and Changchun to train for the Air Force. But within a few weeks of starting his training in Harbin, he is told instead that he'll be put into an army unit that is being sent to the far west of China to help secure the borders out there. And he's not quite sure why this is happening, but he believes that it's part of his mission to do whatever the military orders him to do. So he gets on a series of trucks to go out to the far northwest part of China in an area called Xinjiang that the Uyghurs call East Turkestan, and he'll spend the next 6 years out there. Next slide. This is the other photo of him that I have from his time out there. Both this and the earlier photo you saw were taken in 1953 in a city called Yining, which is in an area that the Uyghurs call Golja in near the border of Kazakhstan, back then Soviet Kazakhstan. This is a summer uniform. The earlier one was a winter uniform. Next slide. And this is the area of his first posting in Xinjiang in an area called Altai. And it's an area of back then, mostly Kazakh Muslim herders. And even now, I think the largest group out there are the Kazakhs. This is when I went there in 2014 to try and understand better what his army unit was doing out there. And essentially, his mission as part of a small group of ethnic Han soldiers who were put into a Kazakh militia that was being integrated into the PLA was to indoctrinate the Kazakhs with communist propaganda and communist ideology. Next slide. And again, this is that area of far northern and far northwestern Xinjiang circa 2014 or so. Next slide. And then his last posting in Xinjiang around 1955, 1956 is in an area called Wenchuan. This is contemporary Wenchuan. It's a very remote area that's even closer to the border with Kazakhstan. And Wenchuan was where he started serving in a military agricultural garrison that is, in Chinese, it's called the Bingtuan system. And it's a very complex system of garrisons that was set up by the communists and the PLA to control the far northwest frontier. The purpose of these garrisons was to produce food that would help feed the PLA troops that were stationed out there. The people who were put in the first garrisons were soldiers who were kind of unwanted by the army. They weren't the elite soldiers. They were soldiers who were being marginalized. That included my father and included former nationalist soldiers or KMT soldiers, and included some Uyghur and Kazakh Muslim soldiers who had been in these militias out there earlier and then been integrated into the PLA. And while in Wenchuan, working, my father's main job was to work on a ranch, which was essentially the Bingtuan, and help herd sheep and groom sheep for food purposes, for both for the troops out there and then for other parts of China. He also worked in a personnel department out there in that post, and then he came across a dossier that was being kept on him. And every Chinese citizen has a dossier or a Dang'an that's kept on them by the system, but they rarely see it. Because my father worked in the personnel department, he got access to this. And in it, he realized that the party had essentially taken him out of the Air Force 6 years earlier and put him into the Army because of his family background, that he came from the British colony of Hong Kong. He came from a capitalist family. He had a brother who was working in the United States and for the military as an engineer. And so the party didn't trust him and had put him into this army unit that was sent out to the far frontier into exile, essentially. But because he worked hard at this agricultural garrison, he won the favor of the military officers right above him. And in fact, they recommended him for party membership, which had been a dream of his for many years. And he also heard a call that was being put out from Beijing for young, educated Chinese to come back to the interior of China and finish their education so that they could take part in the industrialization of China, which Mao was undertaking at that time. So he took an exam, got accepted into a polytechnic university in Xi'an, one that's affiliated with the PLA and is still affiliated with the PLA today. And in 1957, he makes a journey back into interior China, into Xi'an, and applies and enters this aeronautics program at this university. Next slide. This is him in Beijing on a break from university. But in the late 1950s, several things happen almost around the same time that caused him to second guess his devotion to the party and the revolution. The first is that officials come up to him and tell him that his family background still needs further investigation and that his party membership can't be approved until there are more inquiries into his family background. And he knows by this point that there have been many campaigns against Chinese citizens who have questionable family backgrounds. He starts to grow anxious and he wonders about his own future in China. At this time, Mao also, in 1957, at the Lushan Conference, which is a conference of party elite members, decides to purge Peng Dehuai, who was this legendary communist military leader. And many soldiers or ex-soldiers like my father began to suspect that something was wrong because they had looked up to Peng and knew that he had helped lead the army to its victories against the KMT. And the reason why Mao purged Peng, one of the reasons, was because Peng was starting to raise doubts about the economic policy that Mao had put in place in China as part of the Great Leap Forward. And in fact, that policy soon resulted in a mass famine across China that is essentially the worst man-made famine of the modern era. Around 30 to 40 million people died in China between the years of 1958 to 1961 and 62 as a result of that famine. Next slide. My father, who is very emaciated here, survived that famine. He and his classmates starved on the campus of this university in Xi'an, but they essentially survived. And then my father decides he has to escape China. He goes back to Guangzhou, formulates a plan with family members there to essentially get a police officer to give him a travel permit that will get him to Macau, the Portuguese colony. And the police officer is someone who owed the family a favor. So he gives my father a permit, next slide, that allows him to exit customs on the Macau border, and he makes his escape in late 1962. It's around the same time that many Chinese, because of the famine and the economic deprivation, are also trying to get to Hong Kong. And many of them are trying to swim across the waters from Guangdong to Hong Kong and dying en route. But my father was lucky. He managed to get this permit and not have to risk his life swimming across to Hong Kong, his birth city. Next slide. And so in 1967, he decides to take his grandmother and join his older brother, Sam, in Washington. By that time, Sam is working as an engineer for the U.S. military. Next slide. They celebrate their grandmother's 90th birthday at Jade Palace here in Chinatown soon after arrival. And that's where my father works in his first restaurant job. Next slide. We grew up in Alexandria. And then my father goes back to China 3 times in his later life. One is in 1999 on a short tour after he retires from restaurant work. And the next is, next slide, when I'm working for the New York Times in China from 2008 onward. He comes once in 2009 for my wedding when I get married there. And then he comes once again in 2012 when my daughter is born. Next slide. And during those trips to China, he reflects on the arc of China from Mao to the Xi era. In 2012, he coincidentally arrives right in November of 2012 when Xi Jinping is taking power. in China right during the 18th Party Congress. And we, in fact, traveled to Guangdong province at the same time that Xi is making this southern trip to Guangdong. Like some other Chinese, I think many other Chinese, my father is somewhat optimistic about the direction that Xi might take China. I think he thinks that Xi will tamp down on the corruption in China while at the same time perhaps trying to liberalize China or continue the path of liberalization that, economic liberalization that China had been on. I wasn't that optimistic. I felt that Xi would be, essentially a party apparatchik, but maybe a colorless leader like Hu Jintao. I think I was among many people who underestimated the authoritarian nature of Xi. And over the next many years, as I reported on China, I would come to see Xi imposing a much harder grip across the entire country in places like Xinjiang, where my father had served earlier, and also in places like Hong Kong, where my family's essentially from. And so, most of my career has been documenting the direction that China has been going, and increasingly the fraught nature of U.S.-China relations as Xi Jinping tries to expand the national power of China, both economically and diplomatically, but also geographically in areas like the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. With that, we'll go to our conversation here and talk more about many of these issues, and I'll be curious to hear about your thoughts later on. Thank you. And if any of you buy books afterwards, I'll be happy to stay here later and sign the books.
Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you. It's an honor to host this event with my good friend Ken. Ed and I known each other for years. First time we were in contact was back in 2009 when he was reporting in China for the New York Times. And he was covering the clash between the Uyghur protesters and the security. And after reading your book, I find so much connection to your family. I grew up in Gulja, where your father was stationed. That's my father's hometown. And I was born and raised in Kashgar, which is a heartland. And I've witnessed both the post-Cultural Revolution and the 1980s that some people call kind of a revival period for the Uyghur culture. So one thing that really got my attention while reading your book is the guilt by association, the Dangan system. Right. As somebody who's here in the United States, served in the US government, American citizen, I've still been punished for being born in a family that the government did not like and the things that I do. So can you talk to us about the Dangan that you mentioned?
Right.
And the reason for your father's being dispatched to Xinjiang, the frontier.
Right. Well, I think for centuries, different Chinese empires have sometimes tried to control this far northwest area. Within the context of modern day China, it's called a frontier. But of course, as we know, there are many people who lived out there and that's their homeland. So I'm very hesitant to use the word frontier in describing it. But many Chinese view that as a far western region. And if people had, Chinese officials had done something wrong within the system, or there was something about their families that the rulers didn't like, they would be sent out into what was known as exile in Xinjiang, modern day Xinjiang. And so this happened to my father, and the sole reason why it happened to him was because of his family background as a son of a capitalist, as the brother of someone who had gone off to America. And I think this is something that was very obvious in retrospect to him. But at the time, he felt that you could overcome these ways of thinking by proving yourself to the communists and integrating yourself into the system. I think that this is partly a systemic thing of an Leninist organization that Leninism and the types of groups that arose from it are intensely focused on the idea of subversion and looking for subversives within the state. I think what my father concluded was that this type of organization has no room for people whose backgrounds might be different than what aligns with the party consensus. And it's still in effect today. I think that this dossier system, the Dangan system, is something that the party uses to keep track of people across the country, keep notes on them, and oftentimes you can be pulled in by the security services without knowing the reason, and it could be something that was put down in your dossier at some point in your life. I think that we're going to see an increasing focus on, once again, on this hunt for subversives in the years ahead, because we've seen Xi Jinping emphasize this idea of a national security state. And even, as a more important foundation for reinforcing the role of the party than the economic policies that I think his predecessors have focused on. And so this hunt for people with questionable backgrounds who perhaps might have studied in America, who might have relatives in the US, who might be coming from a background in China that has entrepreneurialism as a core focus of the family. These are things that I think we'll see coming up more and more in the next few years in China.
Thank you.
Let me ask about to draw on that, the book is of course called At the Edge of Empire, and you have simultaneously two different empires in a sense going on. You have the end of the British Empire in Hong Kong, your family's ties there. You're reporting during the various protests in Hong Kong, and also your dad's experience in Xinjiang, and you, of course, as Nury mentioned, you're obviously well known for your extraordinary reporting on the protests in Xinjiang, and so you have this duality going on. But one of the things that's fascinating to me is the discussion both in your father's time, and, all of which ties into this question of subversives and trying to control and extend the Chinese empire, Xi's empire, Mao's empire. Mm-hmm. But there's the big discussion of Xinjiang when your father was there, and that later comes up today, and Nury, unfortunately, all too well knows from his own family history, this issue of the number of Han Chinese that are being sent to Xinjiang, which Mao started, and then Xi accelerates. I'm just wondering about your reflection on Han nationalism, empire, communism, and the like.
Right. Yeah, I think my father obviously was among the first waves of ethnic Han Chinese who were sent out to Xinjiang in the Mao era. I mean, he went out there in the early 1950s, shortly after Mao took over. And at that time, the main waves of settlers were in the military. They were sending soldiers out there, and then they set up this garrison system, the Bingtuan system, as a way of creating these posts out there that would be these permanent settlements for Han, essentially Han colonizers. And later on, then they would encourage other Han who were not in the military to go out there. And over the decades, they would set up businesses, set up homes in different parts of the region. The backbone, I think, of the system of settlements is still in many ways the Bingtuan system. When you go out there, there are these garrisons that are now officially not part of the PLA, but are their own system, a very powerful system that it has ties to the top leaders in Beijing. Like this Bingtuan system is widespread throughout Xinjiang. Their flagship city is this one called Hudson, which I visited as part of my research. And they're essentially like these hugely majority Han Chinese cities that have been established. Many of the garrisons today or farms today produce things like fruit, vegetables, cotton for export. You'll find them even on grocery store shelves in America or in Europe. And so this is part of, I think, the US-China dynamic that they're trying to scrutinize where some of these products come from, whether they're being done as part of this garrison system, as part of coerced labor. But it's a very extensive system. And then there are also many Han Chinese who are outside of that system, who are part of that. I think in 2009, when I was reporting on the protests and the clashes, I met both Han families that had been victims of the violence because they were just people who had been encouraged to go out there and just run small businesses out there, not knowing the larger context of why the Chinese government was pushing them out there. And then, of course, I've met over the years many Uyghurs who feel they have no economic opportunities in the region because the Han Chinese are coming out there and establishing their businesses or taking jobs.
Bing Tuan, the United States government sanctioned the XPCC for the reasons that you described. How did that PLA dismantling effort that your father was sent to be part of turn into this paramilitary unit that finally get the attention from the United States policymakers?
Right. And you know this history very well, Nury, so feel free to flesh out some of this history with me if you want. But essentially, when my father went out there, he was coming right after, right around the time that a militia or an army out there called the Ili National Army had fought against the nationalists, and they had fought with the military aid of the Soviets. The communists thought that they could work alongside the Ili National Army while also being suspicious of it, because I think the PLA leaders suspected that it might have nationalist intentions, like nationalist intentions rooted in the idea of an East Turkestan or Turkestan out there. So what they wanted to do was to integrate this militia into the PLA. My father's first posting, as I said, in Altai, was to live among the Kazakh soldiers who were part of this army, to indoctrinate them daily by having by assembling them and preaching about the ideals of communism. And then around the time that he left Altai in the early 50s, the militia was being broken up and put into smaller units in the PLA, into this unit called the Fifth Army that was in the PLA. And then my father remained in this larger unit that was mostly made up of Kazakh and some Uyghur soldiers. And when he was moved around to places like Golja, he was still part of this unit. And later on, he discovers that he's part of this unit of non-Han soldiers and also former nationalist soldiers, because these are kind of the lower level soldiers, the ones who are regarded with more suspicion. And so they're all together in this unit called the Fifth Army. And then eventually, the Fifth Army is put into the Bing Tuan system when it's founded between 1952 and 1954. This XPCC or Bing Tuan system becomes established. Both the soldiers from different non-Han ethnic groups are put into it, former nationalist soldiers are put into it, and Han soldiers who have a suspicious background are put into it. So they're all part of this satellite system of garrisons that are founded around the region.
Fascinating.
Yeah, one of the interesting sort of personal connections to Xinjiang you have is your dad is serving there, and Xi Jinping, who's Xi Jinping's father,
right,
is kind of in charge of the region in some way, and he takes a much softer approach, respects the customs of the Uyghurs, and I'm wondering what you think Xi learned. Did he learn something from his father? Was it the fear of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which the nationalities question played a big role in the collapse of the Soviet Union? How do you account for the shift in, was fear of terrorism? What so-called terrorism? What do you make?
Yeah, why did Xi Jinping take a much harder line approach than his father at the time? I think in the early 1950s, there was still debate among the party leadership about how to approach these regions. Just to step back for a minute, these regions in what's today Western China are a huge part of China. I mean, together, the Tibetan region and Xinjiang make up around a quarter to a third of the Chinese landmass today. These are not natural regions to be integrated with interior China or ethnic Han China. They were put into this area that we call China today by the ethnic Manchus who came from Dongbei or the northeast and then conquered these regions, had different ways of ruling them. I think they had a fairly sophisticated system of ruling the different regions, although they were also very violent. For example, they wiped out an entire Mongol confederation in the northwest area. And they created this inner Asian empire that had this ethnic Han area, the interior of China that we think of as mainly as China, and then these vast regions. The nationalists and the communists wanted to recreate the Qing Empire. The nationalists failed, the communists succeeded, so they took by force all these areas in the early 50s. And so there's a lot of debate about how you rule over these areas that are not ethnic Han. The general who was in charge of the military forces in Xinjiang was a very hardline general named Wang Jun, and my father knows of his policies very well. When Xi Zhongxun, Xi's father, was placed in charge of the policies in Xinjiang as a civilian in charge of the policies, he sometimes would try and take a softer line on the region and tell the military, we can't appropriate land from the religious institutions or from the herders. We need to pull back from that and not create friction between the ethnic Han occupiers and the people in that area. So there would be these cycles of hardening and softening policies in the region. I think Xi Jinping has, he has veered into a much harder line approach. One of the reasons is, as you state, Ken, he's obsessed with the breakup of the Soviet Union. He and I think some party officials have thought a lot about it. They attribute it to several different things. One is, economic liberalization. They think that weakened the Soviet Communist Party. Another is because they think that although the Soviets took a very hardline approach to these ethnic regions in their empire, they also labeled these regions as autonomous regions, although they never had true autonomy, and allowed them, at least in name, to have this separate identity. And so I think part of Xi's drive, starting from around 2014 up until now, is to do this forceful assimilation of these different areas of China into what he considers mainstream ethnic Han culture. And so a main part of it among the Uyghurs and Kazakhs is to suppress the practice of Islam, to suppress the use of the Uyghur language, to suppress many other cultural markers that allow them to reinforce their identity among themselves.
Going back to the early part of the father's time in Gulja, he arrived 2 years after the mysterious airplane crash that killed 5 top East Turkestan Republic officials. It reminds what happened to Prigozhin.
Right.
Just instead of going to Beijing, the airplane was flying over the skies of Kazakhstan, today's Kazakhstan. Even to this day, some historians believe that the Soviets did that. And the Uyghurs are very nostalgic about that period. My dad, I grew up hearing him telling me that they had very vibrant educational system, the military, the welfare. My dad even received a medal from the president of the Second East Turkestan Republic. And with that kind of sentiment, when your dad arrived 2 years later, did he see anything hostile towards the PLA, or they were seeing enough from the Xinjiang and the other warlords and feel that the PLA is the actual liberators, as the CCP, even to this day, educates or includes in educational materials?
Right. That's a very interesting thing that came across in my research, most of my research on my dad's story was based on these long interviews I had with him in our childhood home in Alexandria. And when we were talking, he never raised any issues about ethnic tensions in the area in the 1950s when he arrived. But then late in my research process, I found some letters that he had written to his older brother, Sam, both in the late 1950s, right after he left Xinjiang for Xi'an, and then also in the early 60s when he had made his escape to Hong Kong. And in one of those letters in the early 60s, he talks about, he's recounting the journey that he took, the 12-year journey that he took throughout the PRC. And he talks about his arrival in Xinjiang in 1951, 1952. And he says at that time, he realized on his arrival that Xinjiang was this area of many different ethnic groups. He counts around 15, in his head, and he says they're very diverse in their cultures, in their languages, in their outlook and perspectives, and in their histories. But he says these groups all have one thing in common, and in the letter he characterizes it as an intense hatred of the Han people. So it was my first, sign that there was something that he was realizing about the Han movement and occupation of the area that had created conflict. He attributes that tension to, as you mentioned, Nury, the policies and the control imposed on the area by ethnic Han warlords like Shang Shurtai, earlier in the Republican era, or the the era when the nationalists tried to rule China, and also by nationalist military commanders. So he doesn't attribute it to the PLA because the PLA is just arriving at that time. And I think in the letters there's an implication that in his thinking in the early 1950s that maybe the PLA would have more enlightened policies that could help win over some of the different groups that were out there.
Let me ask you about I mentioned Hong Kong a bit in talking about the edge of empire. The other place, and obviously we're talking about Xinjiang, the other place that figures in the edge of empire is, of course, the Tibetan region. And you have an absolutely fascinating account of interactions with this young entrepreneur, Tashi, who very much seeks to promote the vision of Tibet within China that the Chinese Constitution talks about. I was wondering if you'd say a few words about that. Maybe we'd then open it up to questions from the audience.
Yeah, so I made a lot of trips to the Tibetan regions of China, and that includes, I've been a couple times to central Tibet, which is very difficult for journalists to move around in, and then the Tibetan regions in what are today Qinghai and Sichuan province. And in the plateau in Qinghai, in an area known as, in Tibetan as Gaotang, in Chinese as Yushu, I met this young Tibetan businessman named Tashi Wangchuk. And what he wanted to do was he wanted the schools in the area to at least teach Tibetan in a bilingual manner, that they would have half the classes in Tibetan, half in Chinese, so that Tibetan youth in the area, and this is a predominantly Tibetan area, could grow up learning Tibetan, or at least like being fluent in Tibetan, and not just having to learn it in their households. And there are schools in DC that have bilingual Spanish and Chinese and English. So my daughter's in a bilingual Spanish school where half her classes are in Spanish, half in English. Tashi envisions the same type of schooling system. He says the local officials are suppressing it, and he wants to try and tell Chinese journalists and the courts in Beijing about this, because he thinks that the Chinese Constitution guarantees, it does guarantee autonomy for these areas that are non-Han, but of course the Communist Party doesn't practice that. And so he wants to force the local officials to practice it legally. When he tells us his story, he is then detained by the police and then put on trial for separatism or inciting separatism, and then is sentenced to 5 years in prison. And he serves out his prison sentence. I leave China for the US while he's in prison. And then once he's let out of prison, I hear that he goes back out on the road and still trying to promote this bilingual education system. Language plays a big role in what I saw in China and in the efforts to control different regions by the party and to unify the empire in their view. And I saw it in Xinjiang, I saw it in Tibet, I see it in Hong Kong, I see it in Inner Mongolia, and it's a central thing and a central point of tension, I think, within China today.
We open to questions from the audience. Please identify yourself and make sure that it is a question, not a
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti, and I wonder if you could give it. Thank you for the history of the Uyghur and the other national groups and from that part of China. But I wonder if you could give us a little bit of the kind of the geopolitical history of this. Picked up little things. For example, it was my understanding that that Japan, pre-war Japan, took the position that the western provinces of China had nothing to do with China. They should revolt, and they should become independent countries. And then after the communist success in the Civil War, the Soviet Union took the position that the western provinces, and at the same time, when the Japanese were saying they should be independent, the Americans and the British were saying, no, these are integral parts of China as long as nationalist. They had no right to secede. They were part of China. And then when the Soviets were supporting independence, autonomy, the Americans were saying, no, these are an integral part of China. And then when the communists took over, then it started to change. So how did geopolitics play into all of this? Because it seems to me that each of the Americans, the Soviets, the Japanese kind of shift around depending upon, who's my friend and who's not.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it's, the communists weren't the first government in China to try and hold on to this empire. The nationalists notably viewed Xinjiang, Mongolia, Tibet as all part of their territory as well. And because the Americans were aligned with Chiang Kai-shek, they also recognized the Republic of China's rule over those areas. So the Americans themselves, in that era, they weren't advocating for the independence of those regions. Later on, I think it's well known that the CIA did arm Tibetans, for example, in the Tibetan regions, and I think that was when they were opposed to Mao's rule in China. Then later on, post-79, they take a different view of all that, and they themselves back off of any calls for autonomy or independence in those regions. And even recently, geopolitics plays an important role in U.S.-China relations as it pertains to those Western regions. After 9/11, the Bush administration recognized this group that China had labeled as a terrorist group in the area as a terrorist group under the American system. And there's a lot of questions about why the administration decided to do that. But I think China took advantage of that post 9/11 war on terror era to get the Americans to align with them on this group, which essentially many people question, how big is this group? Is there even such a group that's fomenting a widespread insurgency in the Northwest? But the Bush administration did choose to recognize it, and that in some ways was, I think in the eyes of many Uyghurs, was problematic for their own nationalist struggles.
Secretary Pompeo revoked that decision.
Yeah, right.
Mike
Yeah.
Abramowitz, who is director of the Voice of America. Mike?
Thanks, Ed. I'm just kind of curious about your dad. Is he still alive? And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit, so his life story is so fascinating. It sounds like he was kind of disillusioned. He was both became imbued with the communist revolution, then disillusioned with it. How does he today make sense of what's happened? And is he someone who is wants warmer ties between China and the U.S., or does he want, or is he more suspicious? I'm just kind of curious what his take on things is.
Yeah, and we had many conversations both when he was visiting China and then obviously when I was finishing my book in the last couple of years. So his take on it is, one, he is, he's an American citizen, so his first loyalty is to the United States. He sees this country as the one that gave him opportunities, whereas China shut him out. And he values the freedom here. At the same time, he believes as someone culturally from China, that China should be a great nation at some point. But that's different, I think, than his views on the leadership of China. And that and I think that's consistent among a lot of Chinese I meet, that they want China to be a great country, they wanted to find its wealth and power again and to reach that status. But they also have very complicated relations with the leadership. And so my father, when he looks at Xi Jinping, he sees someone who he thinks maybe he had noble ideas at some point for reforming the party and tightening up the party. But then as the years have gone on, he's grown much more skeptical of what Xi's intentions are. And the fact that Xi has held on to power for more than 10 years, I think raises a lot of questions in his mind, as well as in the mind of many other Chinese. And I think one thing that he brings with him from the Mao era is that when a leader, especially an autocratic leader, holds on to power for too long, gets rid of consensus decision-making, then their rule becomes corrupt, and they start taking a lot more risks. And I think that that's the type of leader we're grappling with today.
Let me do a follow-up question. Your mom is more skeptical,
Right.
and both given her family experiences and her own, if you'd say a few words
Yeah.
about her. So.
And my mom, I talk about my mom's history in one chapter on Hong Kong, but she plays a much lesser role in the book because she left the PRC when she was a child. And the reason is because her family was a landowning family in southern China. She grew up in a town there. And when the revolution took place, the communists seized the land from her family, and then people in the town or village started persecuting the family. And so the family fled to Hong Kong when she was around age 9 or 10. She grew up in Hong Kong and has always had this very dark view of the party and sees it as this corrupt entity, and is very skeptical of it.
Thank you. My name is Hiro Watanabe, Washington correspondent for Sankei Shimbun, Japanese newspaper. Thank you for taking my question and your presentation. My question is not directly related to your topics or history, but tomorrow you have an election. No matter who wins, the result will be consequential on the US and China relationship. Mm-hmm. So give me your thought on what kind of dialogue next president should have with Xi Jinping with respect to Hong Kong, Xinjiang, or Taiwan, human rights abuse or persecution against religious leaders. And also now we see North Korea sent troops into Russia, maybe beyond. We haven't seen such a North Korea's conventional military activity since 1953. So what do you see such kind of geopolitical situation in Central Asia or East Asia? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that both Trump and Harris will have somewhat different approaches to China. They've each made different types of statements on China. I think Trump has been more clear in what he might try and do, like he says he'll impose tariffs on China. At the same time, he's also made remarks saying like, oh, Taiwan's not paying enough for American defense of Taiwan, and so maybe they need to pay more. So he's made a few statements. I think having covered the first Trump administration, it's difficult to say where things might go because oftentimes in an administration, there's what the president does or wants to do, then there are what his top aides want to do. And I think in the Trump administration, that was more in sharper relief than in perhaps other administrations. There were aides around him, including people who are associated now with Hudson, like Mike Pompeo. There are people like Matt Pottinger, the Deputy National Security Advisor, who have very, I think, very clear visions for what they wanted to do with U.S.-China policy. Trump himself was more obsessed with tariffs and with this trade war that he began, and Lighthizer was the main person in charge of that. So I think that in a Trump administration, you might see it go in different directions, but a lot depends on who the people around him are. I think Harris would mainly try and carry on the policies that the Biden administration has started. It's a little less clear to me exactly what Harris's personal approach would be, but I think in general, she would carry on the mainstream democratic approach, which is, China's a rival. We need to prevent their military buildup through these very specific measures like export controls on technology and strengthening military alliances in the Asia-Pacific region. But the Democrats generally say they want to continue conversations with China on issues like climate change and some transnational issues such as that. So I think there will be some different approaches from each of them. But in general, they'll have this, either administration will have a view of China as a competitor or as a rival. I think that that's a fairly mainstream view now across the two parties in Washington. I don't think that will change depending on who's in power in the next 4 years. China itself, I think, sees it that way too. I've talked to different Chinese analysts who say, oh, the party wants this person in power, that person in power. But I think in general, the party sees the two countries as locked in this competition that's increasingly tense, and that they view it as a long-term strategic competition with the US. And on China's part, it includes things like them continuing to build up the PLA and putting lots of money each year into that military expansion. So I think that those types of policies will continue no matter what. On North Korea, I mean, it's a pretty shocking development. I don't know where it goes from here. I know that the Biden administration says that they're talking to China to see if China can exercise some leverage on North Korea. There are people who are skeptical that China would try and do anything to help, and something China would be, in principle, supportive of the North Korean troops in Russia. Some think that China doesn't want this increasing entwinement of European security and Asian security, because in their view, they want to make sure that NATO and European countries don't become enmeshed in East Asian security issues. So I think there are divergent views on what China is thinking about it. But what I know is that Biden officials are trying to talk to Chinese officials to see if they can see some opening there for China to exercise leverage on North Korea.
We're coming to the end of the programming. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with us? I know that you've been traveling to China specifically last year with Secretary Blinken, and then during the Vice President's trip to China in, I think, in 2011, when you were. If you have any final thoughts to share with us on where we're heading, you talked about a little bit, and your general sense of the leadership's approach towards the United States specifically.
I mean, people have asked me sometimes, oh, what recommendations would I give to whoever the next president is? And that's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, but I do think that right now, from my understanding, the US intelligence services don't have great intelligence on the thinking and the intentions of Xi Jinping. And I think that no matter who is president, they need to put more resources into intelligence gathering on the leadership in the top ranks of the party. And intentions are essentially, I mean, intentions and capabilities are two things that we talk a lot about in Washington. And I think it's easy to observe the capabilities of China's national power and especially its military, but we don't know anything about the intentions of Xi and what he authentically plans to do regarding Taiwan, regarding military competition with the US, regarding his approach to Europe, for instance. And I think that, one thing that whoever is the next president needs to do is to figure out better ways to understand the intentions of the leader. We saw what happened with Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Everything was taking place in his head. Eventually, the Biden administration understands that they plan on invading Ukraine because they do get intelligence on Putin. But I think they have much less inroads into the thinking of the top party leadership in China.
Thank you. There's so much to unpack. This is a fascinating book. This is the first time I've been able to learn about somebody like your father was part of the Chinese government then, went there and engaged with the Uyghur people. So I learned so much from this book. And somebody who also recently wrote a book, I know how difficult, I know that you've been working on this project for years and finally came to an existence. I'm sure that your father feel absolutely gratified and satisfied and grateful for your work to tell your father's story, as I have done with my own parents.
Yeah, I want to say that, obviously memoirs I think are important because they shed a light and through a personal lens onto these many parts of history. And, my father's story is from the point of view of someone who travels from a place like Hong Kong in the South to these, what he sees as far-flung regions of China. But I think it's very important to read books that center Uyghur voices as well, such as your memoir. There's a very good memoir by a Uyghur poet called Waiting to be Arrested at Night that came out last year. And I think that those perspectives are important to have on all of these issues that we're talking about here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. Buy this book. The book is available outside. Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you. Edward, behind the book, so please
you.
wait for him.
Thank you all.
very much.
Great, thank you.